My blinds on this side. Oop, no.
Good morning to everyone at home. Thank you so much for joining us for my roundtable on COVID-19 disinformation. I'm Congresswoman Jennifer Wexton, and I'm incredibly honored to be joined today by two very accomplished guests, by Dr. Peter Hotez, who is the director of the Center for Vaccine Development at Texas Children's Hospital, and the dean for the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine, and Nina Jankowicz, who is the Disinformation Fellow at Wilson Center's Science and Technology Innovation Program. So during a public health emergency, people need accurate information from trusted sources. The COVID-19 pandemic has been labeled an infodemic because of an unprecedented amount of misinformation and disinformation surrounding the virus, including its origin, therapeutics to treat it, and the local government's responses. This undermines trust in government, scientists, and medical experts, and public health organizations. It could also jeopardize efforts to overcome the COVID-19 pandemic, putting people's health and lives in danger. There seems to be a perfect storm of events that have allowed COVID-19 disinformation to be so prolific. An administration that is undermining the role of science to inform policy, and millions of people interacting online on social media to connect, with few and inadequate safeguards on viral amplification. This disinformation will not go away once there's a vaccine for COVID-19. Our adversaries understand this playing field, and they are actively using it to their advantage. We need to fight back against disinformation, and that means policies to stop its spread and educate Americans to better recognize disinformation and misinformation when they see it. That's why I founded the Congressional Task Force on Digital Citizenship. And just last week, Senator Mazie Hirono and I introduced the COVID-19 Disinformation Research and Reporting Act to study the spread of COVID-19 related disinformation online and social media. Our legislation will be in the COVID relief bill the House is voting on this week. We're lucky to be joined by an expert in the field of infectious diseases, Dr. Peter Hotez, and an expert on the topic of disinformation and how it spreads, Nina Jankowicz. I'll turn it over to them for a brief introductions, starting with you, Dr. Hotez. Thanks for joining us here today.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Congresswoman. It's great to be on with Nina Jankowicz. Just some brief opening remarks. This is actually what we're seeing, I think, this year in 2020 with COVID-19. I see it a bit as a culmination of a trend that's been going on the last 5 years. In addition to being a vaccine scientist, a pediatric scientist who develops vaccines for neglected diseases and now COVID-19, I'm also the parent of an adult daughter with autism. I have 4 adult kids and have been leading efforts to go up against a growing anti-vaccine movement in the United States, which really has become its own disinformation campaign with 480 anti-vaccine websites all revved up on social media, Facebook, e-commerce sites. I mean, Amazon, for all practical purposes, is an anti-vaccine website now, and I can take you through that. And this has been building, and then starting about and it's been going on for more than 5 years, about a decade. Then 5 years ago, it took this very odd pivot to the far right under the banner of health freedom and libertarian activities, especially in Texas. This is when Texans for Vaccine Choice formed in 2015. Then you had Oklahomans for Vaccine Choice, all under this fake banner of health freedom that gained strength and momentum. Then it nationalized with the formation of national anti-vaccine groups like Children's Health Defense under RFK Jr. And then that really accelerated a lot of attacks against scientists, including me. RFK Jr. calls me on his Instagram site the OG villain, the original gangster villain. So you're talking to the original gangster villain here. And now, you know, we've seen now this globalization of the U.S. style anti-vaccine movement, Israeli in Berlin last month. That had 38,000 people attending. RFK Jr. was the lead speaker, and CBS News and others reported that it was sponsored by the far right groups, including one of the neo-Nazi parties. So this is, and then of course the Russians glomming on, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that from Nina. So this has become a full-blown disinformation, anti-science initiative. And then now what we've been hearing coming out of the White House and individuals like Scott Atlas, which I'm sure we'll go into in a bit more detail. So I think this is a very ominous trend, and it's more than a trend. It's an ominous situation that's now affecting public health. So I'll stop there, and I'm sure we'll go into more detail in a few minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Hotez. And that's exactly why we need to educate the public about disinformation online and teach them about how to spot it and what to do when they see it. Thank you so much. Nina Jankowicz, if you would just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to work in the disinformation field.
Sure. Thank you so much, Congresswoman. It's an honor to be with you and Dr. Hotez this morning. So I come at this from the angle of Russia and Central and Eastern Europe. I started my career in democracy support. I worked on countries like Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. And when the war in Ukraine started in 2013, 2014, it was very clear that we weren't learning the lessons that our allies and partners in Central and Eastern Europe were learning about malign information and online malign influence and how it spreads. And this holds true for COVID-19 as well. As it began to spread around the world in February and January, the first inkling that I had as a disinformation specialist that this was going to become a problem actually came from Ukraine. Ukraine was evacuating some of its citizens from Wuhan. And a fake email was spread around Ukraine that said that these people were infected. In fact, they were not. They were being quarantined for safety purposes. And it actually led to riots in the small town where the Ukrainians were being quarantined. And later, the Ukrainian government actually fairly quickly debunked this email, but it didn't stop that animosity and that spillover into the public safety sector. And it's pretty clear that that email came from Russia. Now, that being said, we have plenty of domestic disinformation, which Dr. Hotez already alluded to in his remarks. And I think this just leaves us more vulnerable to that foreign exploitation. Certainly actors like Russia, like China, have been capitalizing on the disinformation that is absolutely 100% homegrown here in the United States. And what makes this pandemic so rife, such fertile ground for disinformation, is the fact that disinformation runs on emotion. The uncertainty and fear and widespread distrust that characterize the COVID-19 pandemic, both in our personal lives and toward the government, mean that we are just absolutely ripe for exploitation in terms of quote unquote fake news. But the important thing to understand, and I think COVID really exemplifies this, is that most disinformation is grounded in a kernel of emotional, visceral truth. It really speaks to people, and that's why we're seeing it amplified to such a big degree at a time when we are all feeling fearful and uncertain and distrustful. And that's what makes all of this disinformation so potent at this time, and why it's going to be one of the biggest public health, public safety, and democratic challenges that we face in the coming years.
Absolutely. And that's a great point, that it's grounded in emotion. So that makes it a little bit more difficult to combat with the clinical, fact-based countervailing arguments. So that makes it hard. And Nina, starting with you, just kind of to level set, we hear about disinformation and misinformation, and we kind of use those terms interchangeably, but is there a difference between the two? And if so, what is it?
Yeah, that's a great point, Congresswoman, and something that is one of my soapbox issues. We do hear them used interchangeably, but they are different. So disinformation is false or misleading information that is spread with malign intent. So that's, foreign actors who are doing this, or potentially fringe political actors here in the United States. But misinformation is false or misleading information without that malign intent. So that's, your well-meaning aunt or uncle who's sharing a misleading meme on Facebook or at the Thanksgiving dinner table. And that intent is what separates the two.
But they can have really the same practical effect, I would think, or disinformation could in some ways be more pernicious because it's shared by trusted sources or by people in your own network. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So what we've seen actors like Russia and China shift to during the COVID-19 pandemic, and especially since 2016, as awareness about the tools and tactics of disinformation, things like inauthentic amplification through networks of trolls and bots have become, greater awareness in society. What we've seen is information laundering. So a disinformation narrative will be planted in something like a Facebook group, and then authentic Americans will share that content, believing that it is true, not having a malign intent behind it. And that's how it really gains traction. So it's up to each of us as we, encounter information online to do some due diligence and think before we share. And we can talk a little bit more about that later. But there is absolutely a road from disinformation to misinformation, and bad actors, both foreign and domestic, are exploiting that.
Yeah, and I think that disinformation laundering is the perfect term for it, because they just plant it and then it gets taken up and goes and becomes amplified by our own networks, and we don't want to be witting or unwitting accomplices to that happening. So for both of you, since March, what sort of disinformation and misinformation have we seen spread about COVID-19, and who's most susceptible to it? So what have been some of the main themes of disinformation and misinformation? Dr. Hotez, starting with you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Congresswoman. What I saw was the anti-vaccine groups that had rose to prominence in Texas and elsewhere in the United States under this banner of health freedom. When I saw COVID-19 emerge and we were working on a COVID-19 vaccine, I thought, finally, aha, if there was ever a time the anti-vaccine movement was going to go into retreat, now's the time. And it did for about 2 weeks. And then it re-energized in a very powerful way. What happened was, under that banner of health freedom, the anti-vaccine groups glommed on campaigns against masks and contact tracing and social distancing. And this became then a full-on, really anti-science, anti-public health campaign. And that's been very damaging here in the second peak of the COVID epidemic across the southern states. We've seen people without masks in defiance, and this is, I can't attribute an exact number of deaths, but if you look at the 2 peaks of deaths that we've seen in the U.S., that first one in March and April, about 120,000 deaths, and then the second peak, 80,000 deaths. I would say a significant percentage of that 80,000 deaths are due to disinformation. And then the White House began a disinformation campaign, and it was all around doing everything they can to minimize the health impact or the perceived health impact of the COVID-19 epidemic. This is when we began to hear statements that 99% of the cases are harmless. It was the flu, disparaging people who wear masks, discount the contribution of asymptomatic individuals. And then this concept of herd immunity, which was twisted in a way to make it sound as though we had reached herd immunity, and therefore we're close to it, and therefore there was no reason to take on any of these measures. And it had the appearance as though it was done to show that the economy was paramount, and the health concerns were really unwarranted, because this was designed to damage the economy somehow. And again, this has had serious consequences as well. And now the internationalization of this, with this anti-mask rally and rallies in Europe and Germany and London. And I feel I can trace it right back to the original anti-vaccine groups that were really gaining strength in 2015. This is all of the continuation and expansion of this. So it is a full-on anti-science disinformation empire. And now they're starting to target individual scientists who get in the way of it. And the attacks on Dr. Fauci have been well publicized, but even individuals like myself and others, this is causing us a number of issues on a number of fronts.
Yeah, these attacks on science are obviously very concerning, and now they're morphing into attacks on scientists, and this myth of herd immunity. We even heard that repeated by Senator Paul in Senate hearings, and thankfully Dr. Fauci pushed back on it. But it has penetrated the discussion at the highest levels of government, which is obviously concerning. Nina, what are you?
Herd immunity does likely exist, and they may have reached it now in Manaus in Brazil in the Amazon, and the number is 66%, like predicted by the equation 1 minus 1 over the reproductive number of the virus, and it's 2/3 of the population potentially required to reach that level of herd immunity, and the public health implications of that would be absolutely catastrophic for the United States. So 1 to 2 million deaths easily.
Not to mention all the people being infected and hospitalized and overrunning our public health.
And the long haul survivors.
Right, thank you. Nina, what are you seeing in terms of the kinds of disinformation that's spreading?
So I would agree with Dr. Hotez about, the basic themes that we've been seeing, the anti-science tenor to all of this. There are some, really wacky conspiracy theories about microchips being implanted in people who receive the vaccine. There are, conspiracies about how 5G interacts with a potential vaccine. But the one thing that I think is interesting that I would just kind of, as an overarching architecture, add to what Dr. Hotez said is that the way the anti-vax movement is targeting other conspiracy movements using the infrastructure of social media is pretty unique to this crisis because, again, of the emotional nature of all of it. So, for instance, I was doing some research about Facebook groups earlier in the pandemic over the summer, and at the time, the Facebook groups algorithm was still fairly extreme. The recommendation algorithm, they've toned it back now and kind of reduced the prominence of recommendations, which I think is a good move, although it has come a little bit late. But just to give you an example of the type of routing that someone who was interested in health freedom or not wearing a mask might have gone through in May or June, if you joined a health freedom group, you would very soon be recommended to join anti-vaccination groups, white supremacist groups, QAnon conspiracy groups. And now if you go across all of these groups, some of them have been removed, but if you go across them, the content is largely the same. It doesn't matter if you're in a QAnon group or another conspiracy group, an anti-vax group, they're sharing and cross-pollinating across all of these conspiracy theories. And it's having very, very damaging effects on public safety and public health, not only related to the precautions that people are taking with regard to the virus, but also, in my opinion, the violence that we've been seeing at some of the protests and kind of antagonistic behavior by some of the reopen and anti-mask protests that we've been seeing. So it's very troubling. And I think the social media companies were far too slow to react to the type of contagion that was going on in those communities.
And that's an excellent point, that people get caught in this self-affirming feedback loop, and then the algorithms pick up on that and keep recommending more of the same back to them, and so they get these ideas cemented in their head because of the mere repetition of it.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah. I think one of the game changers, from what I can see, and again, I haven't studied this systematically. It's just being the OG villain, you get a lot thrown at you, so you start to see some interesting patterns. And one of them is the fact that when they were in anti-vaccine groups, their funding was modest, their bandwidth was still modest. But by pivoting to health freedom, they started getting campaign contributions, political funding that really expanded across many states in the South and in the West. And now by linking to QAnon and others, this becomes kind of front and center of a far right-wing extremist movement that seems to be gathering funding as well. So it whereas in the past, it was some really terrible stuff on Twitter or other forms of social media, but never gained critical mass. It didn't gain momentum. Now it seems to be amplified by well-funded, well-organized groups that have become very powerful and now dominate the internet and other platforms. And that's, I think, one of the reasons it's becoming so dangerous. It's become institutionalized and linked to well-funded groups. And of course, the Russian trolls and bots and are not helping any of this, and also serving to rev it up and make it very toxic.
That's obviously very concerning, because if they're well funded, they'll be in a better position to keep, growing their power and growing their reach. So that's obviously very concerning. Now, Dr. Hotez, I know that you work in a hospital setting as well. How has this dis and misinformation made the jobs of frontline healthcare workers more difficult?
Well, I don't see patients anymore. I'm in the lab. We're developing a COVID-19 vaccine, but my colleagues tell me that I think it's more a frustration, the fact that they're seeing so many individuals who are coming into the emergency room, into ICUs, who haven't been wearing masks, and a lot of it is not due to defiance. A lot of it is still due to lack of having access to public health information, and it hasn't filtered, especially to some of the low-income communities. But it's clear that so many of the cases that we saw across the southern United States this summer were preventable had there been a national-based campaign to bring us back down to containment mode by not opening up prematurely, by having public health infrastructure in place and advocating aggressively for wearing masks. We could have prevented that whole second rise that we saw in July and August, which was quite deadly, as I say, around 60 to 80,000 deaths. And even then, when you had the White House pushing aggressively for opening schools in the middle of areas with high transmission, I said, look, yes, we can open schools, we can open up colleges safely, but first we have to bring the country back down to containment mode. And I put it on an October 1 plan. Some states up in northern New England were already there. They didn't have to do anything. Other states like Florida and Georgia and Texas, Arizona had a lot of work to do, but we could have brought the whole nation back down to containment mode, and then opened up safely with all of the masks and contact tracing in place to prevent the rise. But no one was prepared to go there, and that was an enormous source of frustration for me personally. I sent plans to the White House Coronavirus Task Force. Pretty much anyone who would listen, I would send it to, and it just, I couldn't get traction on it.
That's incredibly disappointing. If we could have avoided a lot of this, and it's because of people's preconceived notions or the feedback loop of what the real danger really is. So, well, Nina, you've spoken a little bit about the feedback loop and about the way that the algorithms amplify things. What makes the spread of COVID-19 disinformation now different from what it was in the past? I mean, because we know the internet and social media have helped to spread this, and it's something that has really taken off in recent years. Can you talk a little bit about how the algorithms contribute to this and how they benefit from these viral posts?
Sure. So I think the first thing is something you touched upon in your opening remarks, Congresswoman, and it's that everyone is much more online than they were pre-pandemic. We're all using the internet to connect to one another, to stay connected to loved ones that we haven't seen in months. And so there's just a lot more resources, a lot more eyeballs on these platforms right now. And that, of course, is great for the platforms. They benefit by harvesting our personal information, our preferences, our clicks. And unfortunately, the way these algorithms are structured, and we've been seeing this all summer long as leaks come out from Facebook in particular, we know that higher engagement is because of enragement, usually. Again, it's that highly emotional content that causes people to react, to click, to share. And the more people are sharing and engaging with that content, the more eyeballs are on the platform, again, which benefits these tech companies who are harvesting our personal data and selling it for, or selling access to it for micro-targeting through ads. There's also just the infrastructure, as I was alluding to before. It's not just the recommendations algorithm, but the incentive structure on the platform that keeps people engaged. So in particular, groups have become a big problem. And this isn't only around coronavirus disinformation. It also has to do with political disinformation. But after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, Facebook heard from users that people really wanted more private, trusted spaces to interact in online. Rather than the digital public square, Facebook offered them a digital living room, which were these groups. And it's supposed to be, you know, people segmented by interest, by geographic location. And there are many positive groups, you know, support networks for abuse survivors, that sort of thing. But there are also groups where people are absolutely segmented by vulnerability, and that presents a prime attack surface. And they're being incentivized to engage with that content more and more. So if you're a member of a group, as I'm sure many of our viewers are today, you'll know that you get notifications when people post new content in that group. And sometimes some of these groups have hundreds of posts a day. They have thousands of members, and they can be private and closed as well, which means that Facebook says that they are, you know, conducting oversight over these groups, but it's very difficult with the amount of content that they're producing, particularly when everybody is in that echo chamber. But the way, again, the incentives are structured means that you are directed to those groups. That's the stuff that comes up in your feed more. And you're recommended to join other similar groups, which can be extremely problematic when we're talking about, you know, indoctrinating and extremist content. So the monetary structure of these platforms basically fuels disinformation. And until there is some oversight on the platforms, incentivizing them to prioritize the health of the public conversation, prioritize democracy, we are not going to see a change in this behavior, because obviously the platforms want to make money. It's in their best interest to keep their users engaged. And there is a communications scholar at UVA, Shiva Vaidhyanathan, who says the problem with Facebook is Facebook. And I think that applies to basically any social media platform that's selling ads. That is the key, the crux issue. They are incentivized to provide that sort of really highly vitriolic engagement, because it's what makes them the most money and keeps people engaged on their platforms.
And these private groups, I mean, they may have been well-intentioned when they took it to private, but it's the consequence of it is that it's going on without any oversight, right? And we have to trust Facebook to tell us that they're policing what's going on in there. But meanwhile, we've seen the viral spread of fake video, you know, things like pandemic and things like that, which we know are false and get out into the regular discussion and into the narrative as a result of these private groups. And then once you're invited to one, and my understanding is that a lot of them have come in not just through these anti-vax groups and things like that, but in new moms groups and in fitness groups and in health groups and in people who are interested in taking supplements. And then they get this information that vitamin D can cure COVID or stop COVID and things like that. So ultimately they contribute to the viral spread of misinformation and disinformation more than they would have otherwise, because those sources are considered trusted.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And you know, Facebook is conducting some oversight in these groups, but there's just too much content for them to keep up with, and they have to rely on users reporting it themselves. And it's just the structure there doesn't work. Again, the way that the platform drives us to behave, we are less likely to share, you know, a report with Facebook that says, I think this might be disinformation, you might want to fact check it, than we are to just share and react to that content at the beginning. So it's a huge problem. And I think, you know, we're not seeing enough of an understanding from a lot of officials in Washington that this isn't something that is partisan, whether we're talking about COVID disinformation, election disinformation, or any other topic that might come up. Again, anything emotional will do when we're talking about the spread of disinformation. This is an issue that affects public safety. A lot of violent acts are organized in those closed spaces. It affects public health, and it affects our democracy ultimately. It might be politically beneficial in the short term, but ultimately the trust in our institutions is going to erode to a point where, you know, people might not take a vaccine. They might not trust that their vote is counted. They might think that the, you know, pandemic was planned to undermine President Trump, all of these sorts of things. And that the long-term consequences of that are absolutely staggering. And we need the platforms to step up. And I think they need to be compelled to do that by our legislators on Capitol Hill.
So, Dr. Hotez, you're muted. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Yes, I think the one of the big battles we're going to face, of course, is as we learn some of the Operation Warp Speed vaccines actually work and have a good safety profile by the end of the year, is convincing Americans to take those vaccines. We have several surveys now coming out of Reuters and the Associated Press with NORC and other organizations showing up to half of Americans will not accept COVID-19 vaccines, even if they're made available, to the point where, because of that, we won't achieve any level of herd immunity and we'll still need masks and contact tracing even after vaccines are released to the public. And it's coming from different sources. Clearly, the anti-vaccine groups are being very aggressive in trying to discredit vaccines, but there are also some self-inflicted wounds that we're seeing. I think the Operation Warp Speed has now launched a communication strategy or campaign, and in that vacuum, it's allowing the anti-vaccine groups to fill it, or the pharma CEOs who have not done a good job. I mean, there's been a lot of missteps by the pharma CEOs we heard about with AstraZeneca and the story of the 2 pauses that was sent to JP Morgan investors that didn't help anything in the way Moderna has conducted its business around stock trading. All of that is feeding into the anti-vaccine movement. So what you've got now is very aggressive activities of the anti-vaccine groups, on top of the fact that many Americans are just being filled with misinformation or in some cases disinformation, and are genuinely concerned. And I think we're going to have to fix this as a country. And what I've been advocating to the White House Coronavirus Task Force, as well as to the NIH and other agencies, is we're going to have to mount a communication strategy from trusted people in the government who are out there, like Andrew Cuomo was, on a regular basis. Certainly not every day like Governor Cuomo was, but on some regular basis, whether it's weekly or every other week, explaining why these vaccines are safe, why we're not rushing the clinical trials. And also, there's going to be a lot of information that comes out in the coming year. Some of these vaccines may not have very durable immunity and require a boosting. That's going to require messaging. And then which vaccine do you get boosted with? Is it the same vaccine or a different vaccine? Which vaccines work well in older individuals versus those with chronic comorbidities? All of that has got to be carefully orchestrated in a communications program. And right now, there doesn't seem to be any appetite for it. So it's almost like you can see a train wreck coming that unless we can really see an effort by the leaders of Operation Warp Speed to put communications in place. It's a great program. I mean, the quality of the clinical trials, the integrity, the scientific rigor is extraordinary. It's a great program. But without any communications, we've seen how fragile the vaccine ecosystem is. And it doesn't take much for a vaccine to be voted off the island, even if it's a good vaccine. We've seen this with the Lyme disease vaccine that is no longer in use because of public misperceptions. We've seen it with one of the rotavirus vaccines. If we don't fix this soon, people are not going to accept some of the COVID-19 vaccines, and that's going to be a tragedy as well.
Well, Dr. Hotez, related to that, because we have you here and because you're an expert in vaccine science and the development and production of vaccines, if you could, because I mean, I'm not a physician, I don't know much about this, could you please just take us through maybe a little bit about the steps of the various phases of clinical trials and how Operation Warp Speed is able to accelerate those phases, and what corner cutting can actually take place without really, how can we speed up the phases of the clinical trial without calling into question the efficacy and safety of the vaccines? Because my understanding is that Warp Speed is really accelerating the process, but that can be done safely. And can you explain a little bit to me and to everybody watching about how it is that we can be assured that these will be safe and effective?
Yeah, the Warp Speed part is not really rushing the clinical trials. It's everything around it. So it was I don't think it was very good branding. I think it was a big mistake to call it Operation Warp Speed and giving it that Star Trek metaphor. It didn't help anything. Because the Warp Speed part is getting as many technologies out there as you can, different technologies to get multiple shots on goal. That was one way to do it. The other was combining some of the phase 1, phase 2 trials, so that rather than do a phase 1 trial where you're only immunizing healthy adult volunteers between 18 and 45, you're going to start right away immunizing some older individuals in those clinical trials. And then a big piece is around the manufacturing of what Dr. Fauci calls manufacturing at risk, meaning we're going to make these vaccines at scale whether or not we know that they work. And that if you're not resource constrained, we can still throw them away if they're shown not to be effective and safe. And that's really the warp speed part. But that information is not coming across very well. And then, of course, when the White House threatens to release vaccines before the elections, before we know we'll have the information in hand, that caused a lot of damage, no question about that. And then, of course, all the anti-vaccine craziness with Bill Gates inserting chips into people, and Nina could probably go through chapter and verse all the craziness that's out there. That doesn't help. And then, so the message that I've been trying to give people is, look, given the fact that the White House has not launched a COVID national plan or strategy, all we really have is a vaccine, unfortunately. And if you really want to protect yourself and your family, it's best to get some virus neutralizing antibodies in your system as soon as you can. And once those vaccines pass either a formal approval process or something that approximates it through the FDA, the best thing you can do is try to get one of those vaccines for yourself and family. Even if better vaccines come along later, what I've been saying, we can always get boosted later on with additional vaccines, but this is your best chance at fighting this virus, which is causing all the long haul injury and deaths in so many individuals. But again, and I'm out there on the cable news networks all the time talking about this, and I'm grateful for the opportunity, and feel very really lucky to have that opportunity to communicate with the American people. The only problem with it is I don't have the accountability. At the end of the day, I'm a medical school professor. I'm not part of the United States government, and I think, independent verification of the fact that vaccines are not being rushed or anything unsafe is being done is fine. I think that we still need to hear it from trusted people in the federal government, whether it's Dr. Fauci or Francis Collins or some people from the FDA. We're going to have to get those voices out there, and I think it's got to happen soon.
So just out of curiosity, we talk about the timeline, and I know that there's some dispute about how long that timeline will be. Is the timeline just in order to have a sufficient quantity of people who have been vaccinated, and then to have the sufficient control set versus the ones who had the vaccine versus the ones who didn't have the vaccine, and determine what the infection rates are among those two groups, and have a sufficient quantity of people that you can say one thing or the other, and also make sure that there's no long-term consequences to the vaccine?
Congresswoman, you're a great science communicator. We need to. You said it perfectly. That's exactly right. So these are large 30,000 people trials, and in some cases the vaccinated group and the placebo controls are split down the middle, 15,000. In other cases it's 20,000 versus 10,000. And it takes time to not only, and we know also from the phase 1 trials that we need at least 2 doses of each of those vaccines to induce high levels of virus neutralizing antibody and T-cell responses. So by the time you get through those 2 doses and give individuals adequate time between the vaccinated group and the placebo group, it'll be the end of the year before we have that information. And hopefully at least one of those 3 vaccines now in phase 3 trials will be shown to be effective and safe, and then we can begin rolling it out to the American people. But that's going to be have a lot of complicated logistics associated with it as well. For instance, the Pfizer vaccine, which looks very promising in phase 1 trials, requires storage at minus 94 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's a deep freeze. So it's not like you can walk into CVS or Walmart or here down in Texas, we have HEB and Kroger and supermarket and get your vaccine. It's going to require some specialty center. So that's going to add complexity. And that's why Dr. Fauci and Dr. Redfield have been saying Q2, Q3 2021 before that starts penetrating a significant percentage of the population. That's pretty much what I've been saying all along Q3. The good news is the technical hurdle to develop a COVID-19 vaccine is not that high. It's all about, it's an old school problem in virology to induce neutralizing antibody and T-cell responses. So I'm quite confident we will have COVID-19 vaccines. It's just not going to happen and it's happening in an accelerated time frame, but not before the election. We're probably looking at a year after that. And even I point out, even that's a world record in terms of time. So it's a good program, but it's got to be messaged and communicated better.
So the crux of all of this is that we need to follow science and listen to the health experts and trusted sources at the top who are part of the solution. But we also have people at the top who are part of the problem. So for both of you, what do you see as a solution to this? How do we combat the false information coming from the top?
Well, I'll just say very briefly is that it's not just the top. I mean, I think, yeah, there's certainly disinformation coming from the White House, and you've got, the president has finally found a science advisor that will say exactly what he wants them to say, even if it's not based on data. So that's very dangerous. But also, there's not been really an appetite to dismantle the disinformation empire. We know there are well-funded, well-organized groups out there aggressively putting out this disinformation that are not connected with the government, and yet no one wants to take them on. The government has not shown any appetite for doing that, and this is even before COVID-19. I remember, writing an article in the New York Times in 2017 how the anti-vaxxers are winning, and people from the CDC contacted me and said they were very uncomfortable with my writing that because they still had this antiquated notion that if you just ignore it and not call attention to it, it'll go away. And I said to them, that was true before something called the internet came along and social media, but it's now pervasive. And this idea that you just ignore it and go away, it's not realistic any longer. But so government agencies have not been willing to directly take on the disinformation organizations, and the private foundations have no appetite either. And part of it is because they're 501c3 organizations, nonprofits, by their charters, they can't engage in political activities. And some of these disinformation organized groups are playing a high stakes game because they have political allegiance, and they announce that, and they talk about their far right wing links, and the nonprofit foundations don't want to touch it as well. It's too radioactive for them. So as a result, they thrive in this kind of setting.
I hadn't even thought about the whole nonprofit, versus political organization angle of it, but that makes it so challenging. If you have like the American Heart Association or the American Lung Association or the American, one of the other groups that maybe is a trusted source but doesn't want to advocate politically, that they feel that they're kind of hamstrung by this way.
Yeah, and plus, who wants to get beat? I mean, they see how I get beat up and some of my colleagues, and and there's so many other issues out there. I think their reasoning is, why take this on? There's other things they could be putting their energies into. So all of this stuff goes largely unchallenged.
Nina, do you have any suggestions about what we can do?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear when you look at some of the other countries that have had a more successful response than the United States did to both the pandemic itself and the infodemic. They have had clear, transparent communication from the very beginning, not only about vaccines, but about mitigating measures like wearing masks and social distancing. There are some great communications campaigns that governments have done. Unfortunately, we haven't seen anything that coordinated or strategic coming from the very top. And instead, we've seen, in fact, incongruent mixed messages coming from the White House, which doesn't help anyone. If we really wanted to head off, more peaks and more deaths, I would like to see President Trump and all of his cabinet out there as much as possible with masks on. I wish they would stop doing press conferences in person. And if they did, they should be extremely social distanced. But what we've seen in other countries is virtual press conferences, modeling that behavior for the public. And where the federal government won't do it, I think we need to see our state and local governments modeling that behavior, because they are, to some degree, a little bit better trusted than the federal government at this juncture. So I think that's what we need to see stepping in. And I would encourage the nonprofits out there who are afraid of bumping up against those restrictions. This should not be a political issue. And the fact that it is being made one by fringe elements should not deter people from communicating about the truth and the truth of this public health crisis. So that's number one. Number two, we need to continue to invest, and these are long-term solutions. It's not going to, help us solve the information problems of this pandemic today, but we need to continue to invest in public media. The reporting that, PBS and NPR affiliates have been doing around the country about the impacts of the virus on their local communities, I think, is critical. These are often in news deserts, and where there are news deserts and vacuums for local news, that is where bad information, malign information that is targeted at vulnerable individuals tries to fill that vacuum. So I think it's incumbent on the government to continue to fund those efforts, perhaps fund them at more than $3 per person per year. All of that is extremely important. And, over the long run, disinformation, my research shows, we can't just push back on it. We can't just play whack-a-troll. What we need to do is build a more resilient society, investing in things like media and digital literacy, developing the reflexes that people need to navigate this information environment. We all know now not to trust the crank call that is asking for our social security number, or the Nigerian prince who's offering us $1 million. We know that. Now we need to develop the same sort of reflexes for the online era and sifting through the information that's coming our way. And that's not just for children. Media literacy, even in our federal structure, would be easier to implement in K through 12 education, but we need to reach the voting age population, parents, and elderly people as well. And right now, the information that's coming to them, both through the online means and, even our corporate media, is not always the most sound. So we need to think about how to give them the tools. And there are some ideas for that: libraries, continuing education programs in federal and other workplaces. There's a lot of robust ideas that have worked in other countries when dealing with the greater disinformation problem. And we need to start to make those generational investments today.
And that's one of the reasons I started the Congressional Task Force on digital citizenship, because it's so important. And we all have those well-meaning uncles or grandmas who spread something that is completely false and on that emotional basis. And I agree with you. We need consistent guidance, public health guidance that's based on science and fact.
We are starting to see a couple of things happening, which is great. So NVAC, the National Vaccine Advisory Committee, has started to take this on. We do have some nonprofits like the Immunization Partnership in Texas, and a couple of others, Vaccinate Your Family and Voices for Vaccines, but they not as nearly as well funded as they need to be, and we are outgunned. I think a lot of the effort, though, because no one has the appetite to directly confront the anti-vaccine groups, that's become a problem as well. So a lot of it is done around fine-tuning the message. And when you go on to a number of calls of groups that want to do something and they're well-meaning, it's all about the messaging. But then I say very, very honestly, I said, it's great you're doing this, but this is a message in a bottle in the Atlantic Ocean. We've got to really look about how we can use legal means to start dismantling some of the components of the disinformation empire and the organizations. And it means bringing the Justice Department, going beyond just health and human services agencies. And I don't even know how you would begin to assemble that. We have now created a Lancet Commission for Vaccine Hesitancy in the U.S. It's co-headed by myself and Saad Omer at Yale. And we're going to start to look at explore what some of the options are. But in the end of the day, it's going to cause us to have to take, make some hard decisions about how we can dismantle the actual organizations who are out there and promoting this, and very brazen about it as well.
And Nina, that brings me back to something which you said in your remarks earlier about this being a national security issue. Can you speak just very briefly about what foreign actors are doing to manipulate these divisions in our country and ways that they're able to do that with this disinformation about the pandemic and coronavirus?
Sure. So it's really a fertile field for disinformers, whether we're talking about Russia, China, Iran, or even, some less sophisticated nations that are just starting to dabble in this, because disinformation has become democratized through the internet. It's easy and the return on investment is very high to seed some of these messages. So in the case of the pandemic, they don't need to do very much. It's not hard to find things to criticize the federal government on right now. It's not hard to identify the narratives that people are finding most appealing in this time of uncertainty and fear. And so rather than need to be very creative or follow along in great detail, like Russia might have needed to do in 2016, identifying those fissures in our society, here, this is one, yawning chasm. And it's basically any critical press that comes out in the news. Russia doesn't need, and I'll speak about Russia because I am a Russia specialist, Russia doesn't need to create anything. They can just share that piece of information or repackage it with a slightly more critical slant. And then again, target that to the most vulnerable people online who are going to share and spread that authentically. They don't need to pay for ads to do it. We've been seeing a huge decrease in the purchase of ads by malign actors because, again, the incentive structure for organic sharing of this content just exists on Facebook. So that's what's going on with Russia. China is a bit different. They are more of a traditional kind of propaganda approach, trying to cast Chinese actions in a positive light around COVID-19 and denigrate the United States, whereas Russia is happy to play on both sides of the political spectrum and turn us against one another, again, with the ultimate intention of decreasing our trust in our institutions, which at this moment is just of staggering importance, not only with the election, but again, with our, countering of the pandemic.
So the chaos itself and the distrust of our institutions is the end goal for a lot of our adversaries. Is that right?
Absolutely. And we're playing right into their hands right now by not presenting a united front during this critical moment where we all need to be standing together, thinking about each other, protecting one another. Instead, the mask issue, for example, has become probably the most political, divisive, polarizing issue in the United States. I've heard, this is, anecdotal, of course, but I have multiple people in my personal circles who have gotten into physical altercations because they asked someone to put a mask on and it has inspired violence in their, general vicinity. So this has become something that is extremely important and is fueled by disinformation, plain and simple, and a lack of clear and transparent communication from our federal government.
So what tips would you guys have for somebody who sees somebody spreading something that's clearly disinformation or misinformation on our Facebook feeds or on our social media? Do we confront the person? Do we just send it to be evaluated by the social media companies? Because all of this, like labeling things as misleading information, I'm not sure that that it really has that much utility. Because then if something's not labeled, then it has like the imprimatur of being factual, and people don't read the fact check, right? I mean, that's something that we've seen in studies. So what would you suggest that we do if we see people in our Facebook or in our social media feeds spreading this information?
Well, I'll just say, for me, it becomes a matter of bandwidth and time. I can only spend so much time on Twitter, and if I've got a day job, right? We've got to get our vaccines developed. We have teaching responsibilities, and it becomes a real rabbit hole to go down if you start being combative with someone on Twitter. I've just never found it a good use of my time. So I will, if it's somebody high profile who is putting out active aggressively putting out disinformation, I'll retweet it with a comment why this is not the case, and I'll try to put up accurate content about what the real situation is, and people do find that helpful. So I don't get into Twitter battles with people or on social media. What I do is try to put out content that gives appropriate information. But again, without having an ecosystem in place where we know that there are groups that are actively dismantling what's being put out there, it's very hard to take this on as an individual. It's not a safe environment and ecosystem for people to take this on yet.
I think in terms of individual interactions, you're absolutely right, Congresswoman, that the fact checks, we've seen both the implied truth effect taking hold on Facebook. If something isn't fact checked, people assume that it's true, or we've also seen the fact checks not really having the intended effect. Psychological research dating back to the 70s, in fact, shows that when people are fact checked, they're more likely to remember the incorrect information than the correct information. What I think the platforms have been doing that I actually find encouraging, and I would like to see them doing more aggressively, is creating friction against malign content or false content, where there is an interstitial title that you need to click through to get through to the false content. So ahead of time that at least Facebook says it's false, and some people might not take that with very much seriousness, but at least that context is there before they're interacting with the content. On the individual level, I think if you do have the bandwidth and you know something is false, the best thing to do is rather not to call people out in public if there's somebody that you know. If you can approach them through a direct message, a text message, phone call, and ask them why that content seems appealing or interesting to them, and then get into a conversation about it, rather than just dropping a link to a fact check or a news article that they might not trust immediately. That seems to be a better way to approach people about that. And then above all else, I've been encouraging people, as you feel yourself getting emotional in reaction to a piece of content, that is when your spidey senses should start tingling, and you need to be practicing informational distancing as well as social distancing during this time. Put your device down, close your laptop, walk away. And if you're still curious about that content after a few minutes and you've calmed down, then you can go and start to do some cross-checking, check out the source, see if it's trustworthy, see if it has, for instance, contact information, if the author's published anything else. Learn how to do a reverse image search. This is usually a great way to identify if content is meant to be misleading, because images can be misattributed, and you can find that out very easily online. So these things don't take very long, but we all just need to slow down as all of this, malign information is flying around at a very volatile moment.
Yep, the verification by trusted sources is so important, absolutely. And those reverse image checks are also super helpful, because there's a lot of stock images that then are used to make other arguments and other purport to be things that they are not. So Dr. Hotez, what would you say are some trusted sources of medical information on the internet now? Like who would we want to fact check things with or trust for our medical information if we aren't trusting our Facebook feed?
Well, clearly the CDC website has got a lot of good information. The part of the problem with the CDC.gov website is, I know where to look for information, but I have an MD and a PhD, and if you're a lay person, it can be a bit impenetrable at times. It's all there. It's just sometimes hard to find all the content you want. The vaccines.gov is a good site. This is the U.S. government from HHS. The websites of Vaccinate Your Family, the Vaccine Education Center at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia has a lot of content, and so a lot of these things are helpful. And I'm putting up a lot of things on Twitter at Peter Hotez to general content about, especially around vaccines, and also articles that point out how the disinformation campaign is working and operating, because I think that's very helpful as well, that people begin to understand that this is these are the disinformation that we're hearing is through concerted action of a number of both state and non-state actors. I think that's extremely helpful.
I think you're right, because people don't like to know that they're being manipulated. And so, so that's why one of the things that Nina said about like pulling someone aside and telling them that, and asking them, starting a conversation is a lot better than just confronting them online, because they're going to get defensive and dig in otherwise. So that's.
I think even what you're doing, Congresswoman, just by doing this, I don't remember having a disinformation roundtable coming out of the U.S. government. I mean, I'm sure there are others, but this is the first I've seen of it, and I think I want to congratulate you for doing this. I think it's really important.
Well,
and we need more of it.
And thank you so much for joining me here today. I see that we're running it. Our hour is pretty much up, and I know that you guys are super busy. So I want to just say thank you so much for joining me today. And this was incredibly informative. We obviously have a lot of work to do, but I feel like, now we have some better tools to be able to discern between truth and fact. And I've got my work cut out for me as a member of Congress, because I've gotten my marching orders. Thank you, Nina, and Dr. Hotez, that the Congress needs to do more. But if you guys want to just give us a brief closing remarks, that would be great.
Well, I'll just start and say thank you so much, Congresswoman, for having us. I agree with Dr. Hotez. Events like this are extremely important. And I would just add to the list of great websites that Dr. Hotez listed, if people are interested in trends about disinformation around COVID-19, both First Draft News and the Oxford Internet Institute have been doing some good work on this. And you can kind of track the narratives over time, both coming from foreign and domestic sources. So if that is something that's interesting, those are great places to look. And other than that, just slow down in your consumption and sharing of news, and that will be beneficial to everyone, because we all play a part in the information ecosystem.
Yeah, and I echo those comments. Thanks for those websites, Nina, and thanks again for all your great work. And just mention that this is a form of terrorism, and it's not just domestic terrorism, it's international terrorism, and it's meant to destabilize our country and affect health. And one of the reasons why I've been out there and so vocal about it is because whereas in the past it was abhorrent and annoying, now it's affecting lives. I believe that it's resulting in the deaths of Americans this year, and it started with the terrible measles epidemic in New York that landed 50 in the hospital, including 18 in the ICU, and now I think we'll be able to ascribe a significant component of the 200,000 deaths to disinformation. And now we have to call it out for what it is, which is both domestic and international terrorism.
Absolutely. And hopefully events like this one will help get the word out. And hopefully as we go forward, we will all spread the word to our networks about how important it is that we continue social distancing, wearing a mask, washing our hands, all the things that we've been doing all along and everybody should be doing to help stop the spread of COVID-19. Well, thank you, Dr. Hotez. Thank you, Nina Jankowicz, for joining me here today. This was super informative. I feel empowered and ready to go forth and do battle online and in real life. And thank you so much for joining us here today. And thank you for everybody at home for joining us as well. Take care and stay safe.